Hello, and welcome to this training on how to write can-do statements for your language learners. The purpose of this training is to support language educators in writing locally relevant, specific, and measurable can-do statements. Whether you're a brand new teacher or whether you're an experienced teacher, this training is designed to support you in refining your ability to write locally relevant can-do statements. In this training, you will get more familiar with some of the ACTFL educator resources. You'll learn a formula for writing your can-do statements. You'll learn about the benefits which come from using can-do statements in your own language classroom and what things to keep in mind so that they are used beneficially. So let's take a look at the objectives for this training. By the end of the presentation, you will be able to use the ACTFL proficiency guidelines, performance descriptors, and can-do statements as resources for creating your own can-dos, articulate the purpose and limitations of can-do statements, define the components of can-do statements, function, content, context, and text type, and explain the benefits of can-dos for both learners and teachers. Depending upon where you teach, be it in the US or elsewhere in the world, you may or may not be familiar with the American Council on the Teaching of Foreign Languages Educator Resources. The Common European Framework of Reference for Languages, or CEFR, is another such system for language educators and learners which clarifies the language learning process and supports measurement of proficiency development. Although in this presentation we will be focusing on understanding how to utilize the ACTFL resources, much of the guidance can be broadly applied regardless of the specific framework you may use. The ultimate goal of this training is that you will be capable of writing your own specific and measurable statements. In order to understand how to craft can-do statements, however, it's important to understand how they fit into the broader picture of ACTFL's educator materials. The ACTFL proficiency guidelines, performance descriptors, and the can-do statements document all work in conjunction with each other, but they serve different purposes. As language teachers, it's important for us to understand how these documents can support us in developing proficiency-based curricula and assessments and clarifying learning goals to our learners. Truthfully, it can be a bit overwhelming at first to try to figure out how these three materials work together and how as language teachers we can use them. Often these materials are conflated with one another when they actually have distinct purposes, so let's look at each one a bit more closely. The ACTFL proficiency guidelines describe the range of language proficiency development by separating the continuum into 5 levels: novice, intermediate, advanced, superior, and distinguished. They describe language production in real-world, unrehearsed contexts for each of the 4 skills: reading, writing, listening, and speaking. As teachers, we can read these descriptions to help us better understand proficiency development and to understand what our learners should be able to do at their given proficiency level. These are not tied to any specific instructional context. Therefore, they can be used to describe the proficiency of any language user regardless of how they acquired their language skills. Let's look at the novice level speaking description to get a sense of what these descriptions tell us. Novice level speakers can communicate short messages on highly predictable everyday topics that affect them directly. They do so primarily through the use of isolated words and phrases that have been encountered, memorized, and recalled. Novice level speakers may be difficult to understand even by the most sympathetic interlocutors accustomed to non-native speech. Please note that the bolded words are my emphasis and not that of ACTFL. I've marked particular words which are helpful in guiding the writing of can-do statements for a novice level speaker. This description tells us what novice level speakers are able to produce. These descriptions support the setting of appropriate expectations for learning as learners move along the continuum of proficiency development. The guidelines do not, however, tell us as teachers how to teach nor what to teach. The ACTFL performance descriptors, as their name implies, describe performance rather than proficiency. The term performance tells what the language learner can demonstrate based on what was learned in an instructional context. Unlike the proficiency guidelines, these are directly tied to formal language instruction. Also, unlike the proficiency guidelines, instead of specifying language production for the skills, reading, writing, speaking, and listening, these describe language performance for the 3 communicative modes: interpersonal, interpretive, and presentational. The example shown here is for a novice-level interpersonal performance. It provides a descriptive performance outcome for that level, which can be adapted to different languages and learners. According to ACTFL, these descriptions of performance provide an outline to identify instructional outcomes. Educators use these performance outcomes as the starting point for planning instruction in a backward design model. Similarly to the proficiency guidelines, we can see what is appropriate production for our learners. But here, these are broken down into specific domains: function, context and content, and text type, which help us conceptualize the types of tasks we can design for these learners which are appropriate to their proficiency range. These descriptors do not, however, tell us as teachers how to teach, nor precisely what to teach, but they do give us a clearer picture of what appropriate outcomes for our learners should look like in an instructional setting. So we've looked at the proficiency guidelines, which show how language proficiency develops regardless of where or how it's learned. Then we looked at the performance descriptors, which help teachers plan overall course objectives based upon what is appropriate for a given proficiency level. Now let's look at can-do statements and where they fit into ACTFL's educator resources. They were created as a collaborative effort between two organizations, the National Council of State Supervisors for Language and ACTFL, and they work along with ACTFL's other educator resources. It's important for language educators to have an understanding of the proficiency continuum as described in the proficiency guidelines, as well as know how to use the performance descriptors as a guide for course outcomes before they can refer to the can-do statements document to help craft appropriate learning objectives for their learners. This document presents actionable examples in the form of statements that are written with clear, positive language beginning with "I can" that makes sense to learners. As Haxey and Van Houten explain it, the 2017 NCSSFL ACTFL can-do statements show what the performance descriptors look like in action and what the proficiency guidelines describe as sustained performance. In other words, they take those previous two documents and create tangible examples of language use. They're organized by communicative mode, and the document is broken into 3 layers which increase in specificity. The top, broadest layer are the benchmarks, which give the general performance characteristics for each level, meaning novice, intermediate, etc. The next layer are the performance indicators, which give the general performance characteristics for each sub-level, such as novice low, novice mid, novice high, and so on. And finally, the bottommost layer are the examples, which show how these things translate into specific communicative tasks. So the examples show teachers how to translate the broader goals of the benchmarks and indicators into concrete communicative tasks and how to word them in language that is clear to students. Here we see an example of what the can-do document looks like for novice interpersonal statements. The novice level proficiency benchmark uses very general terms. I can communicate in spontaneous spoken, written, or signed conversations on both very familiar and everyday topics using a variety of practiced or memorized words, phrases, simple sentences, and questions. The performance indicators break that benchmark up into 3 novice sublevels, showing what performance would look like for each level. You can see that as learners move from low to mid, they are able to request and provide information with less help. And by novice high, they can even form some original questions rather than relying solely on memorized phrases. This level of specificity in function, context, and text type helps the teacher clarify expectations for learners. The example statements help us as teachers to envision how those broader benchmarks translate into daily lessons and tasks. The can-do document gives specific examples for teachers to modify to fit their own context, but these statements are not meant to be taken and used without modification. They, like the other documents that ACTFL has, provide guidance, but it's up to the teacher to customize these statements to make them relevant to their learners. Okay, so now that we have discussed how to use the ACTFL resources to understand proficiency development, to establish appropriate outcomes for our learners, and to determine specific communicative tasks that are appropriate for each level, let's learn how to actually write those can-do statements so that they are specific and measurable and relevant to your learners. We've just seen some examples of what can-dos look like in general, but we're going to break down the components of the statement even further so that we can begin to write our own can-dos, which will be relevant to our learners. As the performance descriptors already discussed, we can use specific domains to articulate what language production looks like at a particular level. The domains which need to be specified in your can-do statements are language function, the context, the content, and the text type. Thus, can-do statements are made up of 5 parts: the I can statement, which is then followed by the 4 components. Let's look at each one of these components in detail to understand what they are. The first component, function, tells the learner exactly what they're doing with a particular language skill. It's not enough to tell them that they will read, listen, speak, or write. We have to be specific about the purpose for using the language, not the skill being used. Often teachers struggle to select active verbs which are measurable. Words such as understand are not measurable and should be avoided. Some examples of interpersonal functions include asking and answering questions, explaining, describing, and exchanging information. It can be helpful to refer to Bloom's taxonomy of verbs when writing can-dos to ensure that we write objectives that are measurable and observable. Context and content are presented as one domain within ACTFL's explanation in the performance descriptors, but I find it helpful to tease them apart for the purpose of understanding how they each would be used when writing a can-do. All of these components are interconnected, and so they often inform one another, but looking at them separately helps clarify how to write our statements. Here we're looking at context. The context specifies where or how the learner will use the language, meaning in what situation or setting or through which medium. Context is not always specified in can-dos, but it is beneficial to the learner when objectives are so specific that the learner can conceptualize the task. However, if can-do statements are being written for overall unit or course objectives, then it may make sense, in such cases, to remove the specific context if a broader goal is part of that. Within lesson objectives, however, the specificity is very important. Likewise, with self-assessment, which will be addressed in a separate presentation, specificity is extremely important. Content, perhaps, is the easiest to understand of the components, since as teachers, we know what it is to teach content. Content refers to the specific information the learner is relating or interpreting. Remembering that these components are interconnected, however, we need to be mindful that the context will drive the content. For example, if a learner is answering questions about themselves on a medical form, the content of their answers, such as date of birth or height and weight, would differ from the type of information they would give in a casual conversation about themselves with a friend. In both cases, the content could be personal information, but the context would clarify to the learner what the appropriate or relevant information would be in that situation. So when writing our can-dos, we have to consider context and content together to create a statement which reflects the language use which is appropriate for our learners. The term text type is used to mean a variety of things when discussing language, but here it's used by ACTFL to refer to the language a learner is able to understand or produce. It describes the length, connectedness, and rehearsedness of the language, meaning, in the last case, the degree to which the language is memorized or spontaneous. Again, it cannot be understated that the four components of the can-do statement, although presented separately, are interconnected. It's hard to think of text type without also thinking of context, because the context will frequently drive the appropriateness of the text type. Going again to that same contextualized example of filling out a medical form, in such a case, it's appropriate to use just words or phrases rather than paragraphs. However, when having a conversation with a friend, it would be necessary to use more than isolated words or phrases. Now that we've looked at the four components of can-do statements, let's look at how those come together into specific, measurable objectives. In this first example of a can-do statement, we see that the function is exchanging information, the context is that it happens within a conversation, which we could make even more specific by saying in a conversation with a friend, and the content is that information is being shared about hobbies. The text type in the objective is simple sentences. Referring to the ACTFL resources, we can tell from the combination of these components that this objective would be appropriate for a novice high learner, since it involves familiar topics and requires the production of only simple sentences. In the second example, we see that the function here is answering questions, and the context for this is in a survey. The content tells the learner that they will be answering biographical questions, which in this context may refer to age, country of birth, and so on. The text type is familiar phrases. This can-do, then, according to the ACTFL resources, is most appropriate for a novice mid student. Now that we've looked at two examples of how to use function, context, content, and text type to craft appropriate and measurable can-do statements for our language learners, let's take a moment to talk about some of the limitations and benefits of can-do statements. So we've said that can-dos are statements written in learner-friendly language which provide clear, actionable examples of what communicative tasks look like within a given proficiency level. ACTFL explains that can-do statements describe what learners can do consistently over time. ACTFL cautions that can-dos are not a one-and-done checklist. Additionally, they say can-do statements help learners set goals as they progress along the proficiency continuum, but they are not a limitation of what to learn or teach. The sets of examples can be adapted to match curriculum as well as independent learning goals, but they are not a prescribed curriculum. This is why it's so important that teachers use the ACTFL can-dos as starting points for writing their own locally relevant statements. ACTFL says they are a starting point for self-assessment, goal setting, and the creation of rubrics for performance-based grading, but they're not to be used as an instrument for determining a letter or number grade. Note that here ACTFL mentions performance-based grading. That is because they are careful to distinguish proficiency measurement as being unrelated to direct instruction, and they clarify performance-based grading as being that which is done in the classroom setting. We will delve into this distinction more thoroughly in the self-assessment training. For now, let's look at the many benefits which come with using can-dos in language teaching. Learners benefit in a number of ways when teachers utilize can-do statements within their language classroom. The statements clarify the language learning process for learners and empower them to develop agency over their learning. Can-dos facilitate the setting of goals for their own development and reflection on their language learning progress. When students understand not only the end goal, but also the incremental steps involved in achieving that goal, it demystifies the process of language learning. Can-dos also help students connect classroom activities with their lesson objectives, helping them see how what they're doing in class is supporting their language development and ultimately their proficiency development. Can-do statements also offer a number of benefits for instructors as well. Used in conjunction with the performance descriptors, instructors benefit from backwards planning, ultimately using can-do statements to help articulate the learning objectives of their curriculum and to clarify their instructional goals in learner-friendly language. Consistent use of can-dos also supports development of lesson activities which are purposeful and meaningful in helping students work towards real-world communicative development. Moreover, they foster a sharing of responsibility between the instructor and the learners for the learner's language development. Well, as we come to the end of this training, hopefully you are feeling more confident in creating your own can-do statements to fit your local teaching context. Remember to refer to the ACTFL resources such as the proficiency guidelines, the performance descriptors, and the can-do document to guide your decision-making. For those who are outside of the US or use other systems, you can look to your own resources for guidance, but may still reference this tutorial as inspiration for drafting appropriate can-do statements for your context. Remember that statements should be written so that they are clear and measurable, and so that they support real-world communicative development. Specifying function, context, content, and text type may help clarify the objectives for learners and facilitate meaningful task development. Finally, it is essential to keep in mind what can-do statements are not, which is a prescribed curriculum or checklist. They are simply a tool for teachers to customize within their own curriculum to describe tasks that align with the course objectives and to help clarify curriculum goals to learners and stakeholders, thus fostering learner agency through goal setting and reflection. These are the materials referenced in this presentation. Here are 2 additional resources which you may find useful in writing your can-dos. The first is from a world language website, which has an article on writing can-dos, and the second is a link to a document from Utica University showing Bloom's taxonomy of measurable verbs. Check these both out for additional inspiration and support in writing your can-dos. Now it's your turn. You can check your understanding of this presentation with the accompanying comprehension activity, and then move on to the 3 interactive practice activities which will help you get ready to start crafting your own statements. When you're ready, use the step-by-step teacher guide to write your own locally relevant, measurable can-do statements. You can do it.